Okay, this is a little mini lesson on value. These are going to be the learning objectives for this. I will have another mini lesson on value that goes into some uh, more extensive uses of value. For this lesson, we want to learn about simultaneous contrast, value and achromatic value, high key, mid key, and low key values, flat decorative value, plastic value, open form composition, and apparent transparency. So, simultaneous contrast, what is that? When two different colors, in this case value, when two different values come into direct contact with one another, the contrast intensifies the difference between them. So let's look at an example of that. So if we look at this diagram and we look at block A and block B, they are in fact exactly the same value. But what's happening is that the proximity to the values next to each other increase their difference. So if we look at A, it's surrounded by large areas of the light gray, makes that A look darker. But if we look at B, it's surrounded by large areas of the dark gray, and it makes the B look lighter. So therefore, the difference between them is intensified. Light and dark. So value is simply the design term for light and dark. So of course our darkest value is black and our lightest value is white. Our ability to determine figure ground depends on relationships of light and dark. In reduced light, our vision is more dependent on a value than color. So if you're driving at night, you notice that everything seems to be various shades of gray, or what are called chromatic grays. Achromatic grays are grays that are a mixture of black and white with absolutely no color. So the scale that we're looking down here below is all achromatic grays. There's absolutely no color to them. So the relative degree of lightness and darkness. So here's a 9-step value scale. If you look at this diagram, you can see that values above and including mid-tone gray are considered low key, and values below or darker than mid-key are considered low key, and values that are lighter than mid-key are considered to be high key. Here's another example of simultaneous contrast. If you look at the dot through the center, look at the very center mid-tone gray, and you'll see that it's surrounded by black, and that's just to distinguish it. It's exactly the same value. Now, as we move across the value scale, that value stays the same. That's a 50% value. So if you look at it, the lightest value, it looks quite dark, and if you look at the darkest value, it looks quite light. And that's another example of simultaneous contrast. We'll talk about decorative value and plastic value. So decorative value, if you look in the background, is lightness or darkness, stressing the essential two-dimensional flatness of the picture plane. And we'll look at a couple more examples of that. Plastic value is value used to create the illusion of volume in space. So in this little drawing here, the figure has hatching, stippling, and some chiaroscuro to indicate the direction of light. You can see that it's coming from the right and illuminating the left side of his face, and the right side of his face is in darkness. So that creates the illusion of plastic space or three-dimensional space. If we look at our reflectional and rotational tiles, the one on the left you can see is quite flat, but on the one on the right is sort of a clever little use of the figure in chiaroscuro, and you can see that the value is used in such a way that it creates the illusion of three dimension. The other thing that's happening is that if you see the smaller figures that look like they're receding into the background, they're becoming darker, and they're also becoming closer to the value of the dark ground, and it also creates the illusion of them receding. We'll talk a lot more about the relationship of value and space in the next mini lesson. Here's an example by M.C. Escher. I don't know if you know his work, but he's done a lot of work, or did a lot of work. This is from his Circle Limit series from 1958, and it's a special kind of tessellation. It has kind of an illusion of being a dome, looking down on a dome. But if you look at the values, they're just pretty much black and white, and there is some gray. And it does stress sort of the essential flatness of the picture plane. That's decorative value. And here's another piece by M.C. Escher. It's called Drawing Hands from 1948. And you can see that he's used chiaroscuro in the hands to indicate the illusion of the hands sort of emerging out of the flat picture plane of the drawing. Again, the light source is pretty evident coming up from the bottom, and it creates this illusion of what's called plastic space or three-dimensional space. Apparent transparency. So we're going to be working with that in our values scale. It's the illusion of creating a change in opacity from one overlapping shape to another. The illusion is created using values that are 100% opacity and creates the perception that the shapes are transparent in the area of overlap. If you look at this example by Joseph Albers from his famous book, The Interaction of Color from 1975, it looks like there is a large black rectangle on the left, and it's overlapped by three white rectangles on the right. You can see that it looks like they're transparent, but what in fact is happening is in the areas of overlap, the three squares, they are in fact opaque values, but their relationship as the difference between the white and the black makes them look like they're overlapping. So one thing that's interesting to note, if you look at the top one, it looks like the top one overlays the black rectangle because we can see it just barely coming through. The middle one, it's very hard to tell whether it's on top or below, but certainly the bottom one, it looks like the white rectangle is going behind the black rectangle, and that the black rectangle is transparent. This is a really good example of a broad range, very simple but broad range of value. Okay, so here's a little simple composition that I created out of grayscales, and it demonstrates the difference between closed form composition and open form composition. On the left, closed form composition, you can see the composition is completely surrounded by the picture frame. It's very enclosed, and there's a little bit of negative space around it. What I did to create open form composition on the right is just to crop it, and you can see that the picture frame cuts off the bottom and edges of the different shapes, and it creates the sense that the composition goes beyond the picture frame. So that's open form composition. So our next project is going to be to create this value scale. So it's going to be open form composition, where we want to create the sense that the composition is moving off the picture frame and starting off the picture frame. You're going to use 5 rectangles that are all going to overlap each other, and they're going to create the illusion of apparent transparency. So we'll start in one corner, it doesn't matter what corner, and we'll work to another corner. We'll start with a 90 or 100% black, and then it's going to overlap the 70%, which overlaps the 50%, which overlaps the 30%, which overlaps the 10%. And you can see that the overlapping areas are going to be between those. So between 90 and 70 is an 80%, between 70 and 50 is a 60%, and so on. So we'll do this and we'll paint it. And then what we'll do is once we've painted it, we'll take it into Photoshop and Illustrator, and we'll duplicate it in Illustrator. So this example was done in Illustrator. So I was able to pull up a palette or swatches in Illustrator and do the overlaps exactly by the numbers, and that's why it looks so good. So that's what we'll be doing next. We'll be working with values to create this simple little value scale, but getting the in-between values just right is what's going to be the key, and will, if you can create the illusion of apparent transparency, then you've done it right. Okay, that's that.